Does culture influence the way we express and seek love? According to the work of cultural psychologists, cultures who have more threats, meaning history of colonization, and also present threats like unsteady governance, a lot of social injustices. Now, according to that work, the more threat, the need for more cohesiveness for survival is stronger. Also, imagine if you're likely to be punished for speaking up. Wouldn't you want to create a secret language, sort of like a code, so as not to be discovered? Today, I speak about why we speak in codes, even in the way we seek and express love. And if you've been following me, you know I love to call these Pinoy love languages. Are Filipinos truly bilingual? We use the same language at home but speak in love languages foreign to each other, together but separated. Kamusta? I'm Rowan, licensed psychotherapist mom, immigrant twice, first generation Pinoy raising my mixed Filipino-American children in America. I found that after visiting 500 Filipino homes, I continue to be a student of the culture. In this podcast, we would be seatmates in this beautiful cultural classroom. And by the way, did I tell you I need my kapeng barako straight from Batangas before each class? If you're interested in learning the deep intricacies of the Filipino culture, especially as it merged with American culture, talks about trauma-informed care and deepening your Filipino relationships across generations, which includes my fave topic, Pinoy love languages, you're in the right place. By the way, if you're liking the content of this podcast, you'll surely enjoy my free webinar on Speak the Pinoy Love Language. It's free and it talks about how we are raised differently in Filipino household, makes sense how this clashes with the American way of communication, influencing the way we communicate and ultimately our relationship with ourselves and with each other. Check out the show notes. You can get instant access to this webinar. Hi everyone! Welcome to the Speak the Pinoy Love Language podcast. Rowan here. Kamusta? I hope you're doing fantastic today. I am. So we are talking about my favorite topic, Pinoy love languages. So let's just jump right in. When I was growing up, studying the works of Jose Rizal, are you familiar with our national hero? Francisco Balagtas is another author. In their literary work, you will find that they speak in codes, especially Jose Rizal. He was revolting against the Spaniards, but he was using code. So if you've ever come across his work, No Limitangere, the characters play a significant role. For example, in No Limitangere, there's a priest there, Padre Damaso. He characterizes the colonizer, the corrupt Spanish priest. Maria Clara represents the ideal embodiment of Filipina based on being self-sacrificial, mahinhin, mayumi. Sisa, the crazy woman in that work, is the taong bayan. It's the masses who's gone mad from social injustices. Why do we do these things? Why do we speak in codes? The first part of that is what we call mataas na pakikisalamuha, is what scholars have mentioned about the way we connect with each other. And you can find that even in pre-colonial times where we are huddled together. And when you say mataas na pakikisalamuha, that means that we have depth of relational connectedness. And as you know, we're very collective. And when you think about it, they say the physical proximity of an American, when you're speaking to an American, the bubble, if you measure it, it's a bit of a distance, right? And if you have a Latinx person, they say it's so much closer, meaning their comfort of closeness is so much closer compared to the American. And what they say about Filipinos is we're even closer. I think that's really important to know about the culture, the depth of connectedness, how close we are. And if you can imagine, if you're distance away, literally, from another person and you're face to face, for the other person far away, at a distance, to really understand what you're saying, you'll have to really say it in a very linear, concrete way. And this is the way, in general, Western communication, specifically American communication, works. But let's say you're in a very close proximity with someone, you probably can get away with not speaking in a loud volume, but even in a whisper, if you will. And of course, I'm using a metaphor here, but I hope you get it, that when you are closer, you can almost sense someone, like hear their breathing. There's a lot more of sensing. And what you would find is in the Filipino culture, there's a lot of sensing and needing to be sensed rather than verbally asserting oneself directly. One of the reasons why we do that is there is weight put on kagandahang loob, the kindness of one's heart, if you will, and not putting anyone in a position where they will be shamed. And that is frowned upon if you put someone in a position intentionally and they are shamed. And so there's a lot of pahiwatig, which you've probably heard me mention in an earlier episode. Pahiwatig is just a subtle, non-verbal way of communicating. And so, for example, when I was growing up, because my mom is an entrepreneur, people would call her. And instead of saying that she's showering, she doesn't want to take the call, she'd say, "Tell them I'm not here." And quite frankly, and, really confusingly, she can just say, "Well, I'm not ready to talk right now." But in our culture, there's less weight put on being very direct and more weight put on being polite and kagandahang loob, which is that kindness to the other person. Remember, the core value of kapwa is seeing the other as you want other to see you in the same way. And sometimes we overstep, if you will, because we think we are wearing the lens in which we see others see us. So it's possible there's a lot of projection, deciding what to do because that's exactly what you would do for yourself, right? It almost sounds like kapwa as I'm talking about projection. But let's go back to our topic. So I talk about close proximity. If you imagine being close to someone, you can sense them, you can smell them, you can hear their heartbeat. Now let me talk about co-regulation because it's important to briefly explain what that means before we move on. Co-regulation is seeking others to find comfort or to soothe oneself. If you imagine, you can have your own umbrella. That will be self-regulation. When rain pours, and rain would be a metaphor for difficult time, right? When you're stressed out. But you can also go into someone else's umbrella. That's co-regulation. So part of being collective is co-regulation. It becomes a part of survival, seeking the other to survive but also to thrive. Okay. Now, in the Philippine context, there's a lot of variables that we cannot fully control in comparison to our life here in America. Just the traffic we cannot control. You can be stuck in traffic for, 3 hours. I've been stuck longer than that. There's the typhoon. We cannot control that. And there is the government that is very inconsistent, still very unsystematic. So a Filipino knows how to be flexible because without being flexible, if you plan out your day thinking you want to check if you plan out your day thinking you want to check off each box, right? Going to the library, pass by the church, pick up the kid. In the Philippines, you can only have a box or two because it will stress you out. There are a lot of variables you cannot control. And so, going back to co-regulation, this is the reason, one of the reasons why it's important there to be part of a group. That's the way we are reared. The difference is when you grew up in the Filipino family unit, you're prepared to be successful in the group. So from the bahay, the house, you transfer into the school system. In the school system, there's the barkada, there's all groups, extracurricular. When you present or represent, even in a classroom, if you're the best athlete, many times I could not remember as a child that the trophy actually belongs to the class. It's very collective. And if a child is successful navigating groups of circle, then therefore he could be successful in navigating his own space. It's kind of like the other way around in the American culture. So in the American family unit, a child is prepared to be independent because independence translates in school. You have to be able to do stuff on your own, express your teacher what you need. And when we have kids that go to daycare, for instance, it's very important that they can go to the bathroom on their own. One of the requirements is that they're potty trained, right? So independence, there's a difference. And so when you are successful being an independent person, then you can be, who knows, be great in a community setting. Do you see the order is the opposite? The Filipino family unit versus the American or the Filipino American family unit. So the way we co-regulate is different. Now, because there's a lot of variables we cannot control, I think it really influenced the way we parent our children. If you could be just picked up out in the street, if you're, protesting, doing stuff, a parent unconsciously want to tailor their parenting to fit the system, right? The goal, even for animals, is to keep their young safe. So safety before growth, right? And so in our culture in the Philippines, if you have money, for sure you're more focused on thriving, but the masses, most people may be focused with survival, which makes sense. And one way to survive is to use codes, right? Especially if you are threatened. There is a disparity with the hierarchy of the rich and the poor. You use a lot of pahiwatig because you don't want to get in trouble. So we've learned to use codes. And like I mentioned, when there's a lot of threat outside, that makes sense. But I also did mention that part of our ancestral connection with each other, that's also another explanation, is that we have this depth of connecting with the other, even absent of words. I think it's very confusing in the Filipino-American culture, but it's an adaptive way of communicating back in the islands. But obviously, the question is, how do we bridge this gap? How do we meet in the middle? How do we extend to our immigrants to express a bit more linear so they can be understood? And also, how can we share some tips to our Filipino American on sensing our immigrant parents, our elders? In just a few after this quick break, we'll explore how the Filipino parenting is influenced by the outside forces that happens around them and how we express affection we call Pinoy love languages. Stick around, diyan ka lang! This episode is brought to you by Story Therapy. This is therapy and coaching blended together that hugs neuroscience, creativity, and honoring the wisdom of your body to heal. It's a 3-month framework that includes 10 one-on-one sessions with me To check out if we're a good fit, see the link in the show notes for a complimentary consult. So, welcome back. Let's talk about the approach of Filipino parenting. So, if things are a little bit disorganized around us, and if we're expecting our children to sense us, how does that affect the way we parent our children? So, there's a lot of talk about shame. Now, let me talk about shame, adaptive shame, and toxic shame. Now, all shame is not healthy, but adaptive shame is when in a particular family or culture, so in the context of Filipinos in the Philippines, shame would have to be used so that you are curbing controlling behavior so as not to get your child in trouble in a more macro system. So the child would not be jailed, the child would not be picked up in the streets, if you will, the child would not answer back to their boss because that would be costly. So adaptive shame is never good, but adaptive shame has a focus on survival. Now, it becomes toxic when we learn these tools at trying to adapt to our current situation, but it doesn't inform us anymore, or the situation has passed. We don't need to be using it anymore, but we continue to use it. We see this a lot, like Filipino American, the young would share this, that they feel shamed. It's possible that their parents have been shamed as children because, as I've always shared, the shamer was once shamed. I've never met a shamer who wasn't shamed as a child. If you know one, just text me and I'll be interested about this case study. But the toxic shame is when parents, let's just talking about the Filipino immigrant parent, continues to use that strategy when it no longer is a way to adapt. It just becomes an automated way of dealing with things or controlling behavior. So that's when it becomes toxic. In immigration, using shame, especially when the norm of expressing the self and the right of self-determination, that's the focus, the emphasis here in America. When we're using shame here in this context, it can have a more damning consequence for our children. By the way, if you're really interested in this topic, go ahead and snag the free webinar that I mentioned earlier, Speak the Pinoy Love Language. There I speak about, it's almost an hour of me talking. If you enjoy this type of topic, visit the show notes for more. Now, again, so let's talk about the way we seek and express love using pahiwatig. So there's a lot of ways that we do this. And as mentioned, we have rehearsal. I think I mentioned this in the earlier episode. And the way we want to be needed is through sensing the other, which is actually what we call pakiramdam. It's one of the Filipino core value. And so it almost seems like if you tell someone this is your need, it negates when someone actually does it for you. In fact, a Filipino parent may say, wala ka talagang kusa. Kusa is a word where you do something without being told. And it's all about sensing. This pakiramdam is really just the most complex. And I know can be super irritating, especially in the Filipino-American culture. Why can't you just say what you mean and mean what you say? And that's really the gist of the Pinoy love language. What I want you to remember is that even though we don't express or seek affection verbally, there's a lot of other cues that are present. Now, the American eye is very focused on what's said, but we know in many studies, stories are beyond words. We communicate, I think, 80% using nonverbal cues. And so it's learning that there are other ways to read. Now, I do not expect you just read non-verbally. Like I always believe, it's really evolving into negotiating. What you would find is that once you sense a little bit more, let's say mom, and you learned how to pacify her a little bit, really understand her needs, then you can negotiate a better way of communicating. For instance, mom, you know what? When you don't say anything and you just use that silent treatment, it's so irritating. I don't know how to help you. You know, I care about you, I love you, but I just can't read it. Can you give me a clue that I can easily read? Then you can think of a word like ay kainis, for instance. When mom says that, that means she's just super irritated and she needs you. She needs to be comforted, even if she says doesn't need the comfort. I know it's confusing, but coding it, right? The key is once you are able to read it just enough. We're not in the Philippines, so Philippine psychology and Philippine American psychology is indeed different. But just enough, really the goal is to create a more stronger foundation so you can negotiate your space. Therefore, negotiating your relationship. So I want to thank you. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. It's super fun. Don't forget, if this has been helpful, share this podcast and better yet, leave me a stellar 5-star review so other people can take a listen too. Ingat and sa uulitin. Bye!